Hello, everyone. I'm Joyce Brand, and I am thrilled to be here. And part of that is because if you're here, that means you're a builder. You're building something new, and that means you're a hero. So, thank you for letting me talk to you. This structure determines outcomes. That sounds abstract. So, let me ask you something. If you had to bet which system would last longer, one that's based on centralized enforcement or one that's based on voluntary alignment, where would you place your money? Your instinct in that says something important. Now, in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you a pattern that most people never see, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. First, I'd like to tell you why I care. In 1981, I was selling office equipment in Portland, Oregon. My job was to show businesses how they could increase their productivity, serve their customers better, and earn more profit. And one day, out of the blue, I got a call from the manufacturer of one of the electronic typewriters that I was selling. Because of a government contract, they had gotten an order for 5 high-end memory typewriters, which is very expensive. And all I had to do to get my commission was just deliver the machines and show the secretaries how to use them. When I met the secretaries, I was surprised to discover that all they did was fill out forms. So they didn't even need any kind of memory typewriter at all. In fact, it made it harder for them to be able to put the position of forms because of the advanced features. And so I was mystified. Why on earth would they spend all that money? What a waste. So the office manager explained it to me. The department head had an equipment budget that had to be spent before the end of the year or it would be lost. And that would impact the budget in future years. So what? Well, the status and promotability of the department head depended on the size of the budget and the size of the staff. It turned out his incentives were the exact opposite of my regular customers. And that's when it clicked on me. This is how the system works. The money comes from taxpayers, which is coercion, not from voluntary buyers, which is consent. The problem was, it wasn't just this one mistake, one man. It was every decision maker at every level was making decisions that were perfectly rational, but they were based on misaligned incentives. And because of that, the structure, the way the system worked, was sort of waste was baked into it. And I felt so frustrated. It almost overwhelmed me because there was nothing I could do about it. It was the system. But what I did was start studying economics and political philosophy while I was pursuing a series of careers, sales, management, consulting, even film editing in Hollywood, which was really fun. But it took me 30 years to learn what the solution was for these government incentives. Voluntary systems align incentives for human flourishing. That made me start thinking about, can we design jurisdictions that are based on incentives for responsibility rather than bad incentives? When I realized that incentives were structural, I started thinking of governance like I think about a building. It's like if you remove, if you get down to bare bones, a building is like a governance structure. First is the land. Coercion seizes land by force. But consent secures the land through agreement, which makes it have a start out strong. The foundation is the next level, and the foundation is like the substrate, the legal footing, economic viability. Coercion is misaligned from the very beginning, and cracks in the foundation don't heal, they just get worse. Consent, on the other hand, creates alignment from the very beginning, a strong foundation that gets stronger with use. The roof and the beams are protection from above, from greater powers. And coercion's roof is brittle because it's imposed legitimacy, while consent's beams are based on performance, and so they grow stronger and hold the roof in place. The outer walls protect from outside dangers, hostile neighbors, predators. Coercion has porous walls because they're resented, but consent creates walls that are protected by the people that benefit from it. People protect what they choose and what they want. The inner walls create order, and coercion, it feels like prison bars. I mean, these should be rules for coexistence, but coercion's rules feel like something that you have no choice over, while consent's walls are defended by the people that benefit from them. The last thing is the facade. Coercion needs a beautiful facade to hide the cracks, to hide the injustice, whereas consent builds on performance. It builds trust because people experience how they benefit from it. And so overall, coercion creates fragility. Consent creates alignment, and alignment is the prerequisite for anti-fragility, a system that lasts. Coercion and consent are opposites, but they're actually on a continuum. So you can see through history, we can see the spectrum. So, for example, the Roman Empire started out as the Roman Republic, and it was one of the most consent-based systems in existence at the time. But it grew through conquest and taxation and slavery until it became one of the greatest empires ever. And it was at first very much admired. I mean, people thought this was great, that it imposed the Pax Romana on the lands that it conquered. So this was very much admired, except there were still, even from the beginning, signs of fracture. A gladiator named Spartacus led a slave revolt, which ended in him dying in battle, and 6,000 slaves crucified on the Appian Way. So that was the first sign of what was to come. Even as it grew, coercion has a way of growing. It tends to always grow because the people that like control want to stay in control. And so as it grew, it took centuries for Rome to fall. But eventually, over time, as corruption grew and it overextended and currency debasement and more misaligned incentives, when Rome finally fell, it wasn't because it was attacked from outside. It fell because it couldn't The structure couldn't carry the weight of what it had become as it became more and more coercive. The Soviet Union, a more modern example, was a much shorter empire, but it was admired at first for it was supposed to create peace and prosperity through its central planning, and people believed that for a while. Alexander Solzhenitsyn showed that the cruelty behind the promises, and the Soviet Empire fell so fast, most people didn't even expect it. Let's see. Consent-based. I mainly want to talk about consent-based systems because they're built differently. They're built on when people choose to be there, it's a totally different experience than the kinds of governments where people are there because they have to be. When people are forced to stay, problems get hidden and they grow. When people can leave, problems surface right away and they get fixed so that people don't leave. So that's one of the biggest differences, but there's more. There's consent-based governance is about voluntary rules. What's happening now in the world, and this is largely because of technology, as Ugo talked about earlier today, when you have this new technology, you have new paradigms. And I think we're now seeing a new paradigm where there are entrepreneurs building new jurisdictions, decentralized jurisdictions, where people can choose to be there or not be there. They can choose the rules they want to live under. They're run by entrepreneurs, run by contract rather than by politics. And most important, they're opt-in and opt-out. So that means that government can be a service, can be seen as a service where you can subscribe and unsubscribe. And you can choose how much government you want. I mean, we do need government for security, protection of life, liberty, and property. We need it for a legal system that we can agree on and the feeling that there's fairness, justice in the system. And we need infrastructure. And those basic things, pretty much everyone wants, and you need government for it. But other things, services that the government forces you to use, smaller jurisdictions can choose whether to offer them or not. And so you have the option, and that's the beauty of it, having the choice to choose the rules you live under. And these are not now being built. These are not just theory. I mean, it's a great theory, but it's not theory. It's actually happening now. And we have case studies now that show us how consent-based governance works, where coercion-based governance doesn't. So I'd like to tell you about, Ugo mentioned the Zedes in Honduras. And this was, new models tend to show up where they're needed most. And in Honduras, there was a coup in 2009, and a group of Hondurans felt that they wanted their country to be better, obviously. And they had a new idea that it had to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And so they created not just a new plan or a new system, they created a new structure that would encourage investment, prosperity, the growth. And they got practically the whole Congress to pass this. It was the law for zones of employment and economic development, which is ZEDES by the Spanish acronym. And they were autonomous, the most autonomous zones that had ever been authorized. And they were run by entrepreneurs contractually rather than being run by politics. And there are two examples of them that look extremely different. I mean, I don't know, how many of you have heard about Prospera on the island of Roatan? Yeah, it's pretty well known. How many of you have heard about Ciudad Morazán? That's Morazán City on the mainland. Not so many, a few. As different as they look, and they are different in terms of their personalities, the leadership styles, the strategies, the market that they're serving, the people, because there's a big difference in the location, in the land, the territory. They look so different. But the important thing is their similarities. They are both based on the most, I think, forward, advanced political organization or political theory ever come up with. What they share in common is they're totally voluntary and people can come and go. The revenues of the company that runs them depends on the success of the people that live there. They offer independent dispute resolution. They have monetary freedom. You can use any kind of currency you want in either of them. So the things that they have in common, perhaps the most, is that opt-in and opt-out, the chance to choose, and their size, because they're small. Morazán it's on the mainland. It's in the most dangerous region in the country, at the industrial hub. It's only 60 acres of farmland. They both started on territory with no prior legacy, government, or history, no prior inhabitants. And it's protected by a wall, which is its boundary. And so this is the land substrate, the territorial substrate that sort of holds the legal container that the law had created. When Ciudad Morazán started, Morazán in English, the very first commercial tenant, before there were even any houses, was a woman named Rosa, a hardworking Honduran woman who noticed that the workers who were building the new wall and the new structures needed drinks and snacks and things, so she brought them in, and she made a contract with the developer for $10 a month for a little space under a tree for her little hut, plus 24/7 security. And that was the beginning of contractuality in Morazán, the beginning of community legitimacy because of economic performance. Her little contract showed how it works when the incentives are aligned, both for her and for the zone. So she was successful. As soon as there were some houses built, she rented one for her little cafe, and she soon had employees. And I remember how proud she was when she was able to afford the ice cream freezer service, and that showed her success. Now, Rosa's story is very personal. But I'd like to tell you a very different story that's very recent. There was an incident that was unusual in Morazán recently. A woman attacked her boyfriend in the park. And what's important is not the details of the incident or what happened, but it was the way the city responded to that. Morazán has weekly meetings that anybody can attend, not just staff and residents, but anyone can attend and participate, talk about what they want. And in this case, It was brought up and discussed. There was evidence shown so that everybody could review the procedures and what had happened and make corrections. And this kind of transparency and proportionality and resolution of problems, this is what I meant by when people can leave, the problems show up quickly and are solved. And that's an example of it. When I think most of you know about the hostile Honduran government that basically attacked the Zetis as soon as it came into power in 2022. When that happened, the founder of Morazán, Massimo Massoni, told me that he thought there was only about a 15% chance that the zone would even be able to survive. Because at the time, we didn't realize what Morazán had going for it structurally. And we were thinking like, well, you know how governments are so powerful, they can just send in the men with the guns and tear everything down. But what happened was, what we found, if they could have, they would have, but they didn't because they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't was because the cost would have been too great. If they had, it would have been political, financial, legal, all kinds of problems. They could not do it. And so Morazán survived. And you've got to wonder, how did such a tiny little jurisdiction that was just getting started survive all of the attacks, everything that the government did? And they did do everything they could. They, between bureaucratic strangulation, threats of expropriation, false media stories, everything that they did hurt, but Morazán survived. Yeah, that deserves some applause. It really does. Surviving under attack. Who would have thought? Now, I wanted to also mention, Prospera has a good example of how this law, which applied to both cities, but they used it because of their market being, like foreign investors and a totally different problem that they were solving. They used insurance as regulation. Most places you have regulators that make all these rules that everybody has to follow that costs a ton for anybody to be able to comply with the regulations. And they don't work anyway, and they always get captured by the industry that they're regulating. So what Prospera does differently is insurance as regulation. Businesses can choose the framework that they want to operate under, the regulatory framework, but they have to get liability insurance from market insurers with skin in the game. And that alignment of incentives is what makes the regulations work. And for example, there is an example of that I think is very telling, a company called MiniCircle that does biotech research in Prospera. If they had to try to do it in the USA, the FDA would cost way too much that they'd never be able to afford to do the research. And even if they could afford it, it would take years for it to go through FDA approval. But what they could do in Prospera was to find an insurer willing to insure them, to make sure that they were going to be safe, filling the safety obligation, which is what regulation is supposed to be about. And they proved by having performance with no scandals, no problems, they proved that it worked. And this is a new idea. I mean, I don't know of other jurisdictions that use insurance as regulation, but it's certainly an idea that's come. And it's one of those things, one of those ideas that the technology, we couldn't have consent-based governance, 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago or whatever, because of the technology. But now, not only, I mean, we have the communication technology, the transportation technology where people can move where they're treated best. We have the information technology. And all of this is making possible consent-based governance that was never possible before. And that, you know, this contractual, it is contractual governance. And as long as you have your structure correct so that contracts can be enforced, then you can have these agreements that you know can be solve any problem that government ever claims to solve and doesn't. So, Prospero had some advantages in its location. It was able to avoid some of the bureaucratic strangulation that was much more damaging in Morazán. I mean, Morazán had, because it was designed to bring together manufacturers and workers, it depended on manufacturers bringing their jobs into the zone, and the government threatened to expropriate any manufacturer that brought their jobs, brought their business into the zone. So that did slow down the growth in Morazán. Prospero was able to sort of get around that more, things like custom. The bureaucratic problems with the customs office was really, really bad in Morazán because it's 35 minutes away from the port, and they could really strangle any kind of import and export. And Prospero was able to get around it because of its location on an island, which is good. But the point is that both of these tiny jurisdictions, and Prospero was just as small, like Morazán only had about 20 residents, including me, at the time that new government came in, and Prospero didn't have any residents. They just had a beta building, and they both grew. Not only did they survive all these attacks, but they actually grew. And growth under attack is so much stronger than growth under permission. And that the fact that they both, for very different reasons, they both use structure as their survival depended on their structures. With Morazán, it was like community legitimacy as well as the statutory legitimacy. With Prospero, it was international treaties that with international investors. And those international treaties are a big part of what prevented the government from doing even more than what they did because they couldn't get away with it. But both of them survived and grew for the same structural reasons. And that's what I wanted to look at, is the structure of coercion versus consent. All of our governments have been coercion-based in the past, or almost all. There have been a few examples in history that were more consent-based, but what we struggle with now, our problems around the world, are based on governments that have grown more powerful all the time, more coercive, more intrusive into everyone's lives. And so people are looking for ways to live together that are more humane, more human flourishing, where people can actually choose how they want to live, the work they want to pursue. And this is proof that autonomous, consent-based governance with the right structure can actually grow even under sovereign risk. So the insight is pretty simple. Voluntary systems align incentives for human flourishing. Incentives shape behavior. And that means that structure determines reality, the outcomes. Thank you.